All right, it looks like most people are in from the webinar opening up. So I think we can get started since we only have an hour together. First, I want to say everybody welcome. This is the webinar on accessible democracy, removing barriers for voters with disabilities. About 1/3 of the 61 million Americans with disabilities are eligible to vote. Citizens with disabilities, though, vote at lower rates and report numerous difficulties in voting, much more than voters without disabilities. This is despite the fact that we have numerous legislative measures to provide protections. Today, we're going to explore what can be done to make elections more accessible for voters with disabilities, and how can government, technology, and academia contribute to this dialogue? What is needed to creating the lasting change? We are joined by 3 panelists today. I'm going to briefly introduce them and then ask them to introduce themselves for just a minute. I have Virginia Atkinson, who's the Senior Global Inclusion Advisor at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES. Ms. Atkinson has 15 years of advocacy and capacity building experience empowering people with disabilities in 29 countries. We also have Commissioner Thomas Hicks of the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission. Tom has focused his efforts on voter access and is a frequent speaker at conferences worldwide on issues such as voter access and cybersecurity. And our last panelist is the Director of Global Services and Certification for Smartmatic. Edwin Smith is an election technology industry veteran. He advises Smartmatic's product development team on election technology accessibility issues to ensure that people with disabilities can vote independently and equally. So right now I'd like to hand it over to Virginia just to make a brief commentary, and then we'll move to the next panelist.
Sure, thank you, Valerie, for that kind introduction. I mean, the only thing I think that's important to add to that is that my role at IFES is working to make sure that people with disabilities are included in political and public life. And that includes partnering with disabled persons organizations, or DPOs. I'll try not to use too many acronyms, and also working with election management bodies on implementation and enforcement of Article 29 of the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And this is the article related to political participation. And that treaty is sort of the international standard that has been signed and ratified by over 90% of countries around the world, but not yet the US.
Very good. Commissioner Hicks, can I turn to you next?
Sure. Thank you, Professor Karr or Valerie. I want to say thank you for inviting me here today as a native Bay Stater. I'm sorry that I cannot be right there at UMass, but I'm actually in Dorchester today, visiting my parents. But I wanted to say I wish that we could all be together over at UMass, because I remember being there a few times in my youth growing up. The EAC is an agency that was established by the Help America Vote Act of 2002. It's an independent bipartisan commission adopting voluntary voting system guidelines and serving as the nation's clearinghouse for election administration. We also test and certify labs and voting systems, as well as audit HAVA funds. And we have a clear mandate for ensuring that Americans who have disabilities can vote independently and privately and as freely as everyone else. And the last thing I would point to is that we just changed our symbol, our logo, which is over my shoulder here. The EAC saying the Election Assistance Commission, and those dots actually spell out Braille in Braille vote. So that's our commitment to voting, is that we want to ensure that all people can vote independently and privately. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion.
Thank you, Tom. You're a little bit closer to UMass right now. Virtually, I'm not in Dorchester, but I appreciate that you're local. Edwin, can I have you introduce yourself next?
Yes, thank you. Once again, my name is Edwin Smith. I'm with Smartmatic. And I've been in the elections industry for just shy of 20 years now. And along the way, I've held a number of roles, and my favorite is certainly getting involved with product design and later in the cycle field deployment of the voting systems and helping voters with accessible needs to actually exercise their franchise and be able to vote. I've seen and worked with voters who had missing limbs, who had severe cognitive impairments, who voted from their wheelchair, and just saw just the delight on these voters' faces when they were able to vote privately and independently for the first time in their lives, and not have to have an assistant or rely on an assistant to actually cast their ballot for them. So it's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for joining us. I'm very excited about today's discussion. First, we have a very short video which we'll share, and then we'll go into question and answers.
Well, before, when we had to go in and do the InVacare system and plug in the things, it was a little bit more difficult because in a chair to wheel up and to find the pen, put in the ballot all the way to the back. In some situations for me, I could get up to a certain extent, but for people who are permanently in a wheelchair, it's much more difficult for them to get into the thing. So compared to these machines now, where you can go approach it and it's all right there, and it's simply put it into the machine. It's less frustrating and it's easier going as you work the machine. And it's just overall simple process. Used to have a ABR before, which was just for a disabled booth. Now it's all incorporated in the one machine where you have issues hearing, we have a touchpad that will help you through the process. If you're blind, we have audio. So all those things, so we're covering all the bases of people with all kinds of disability.
I think one thing interesting about that video is that they talk about the fact that you used to have accessible voting booths, just one booth for anyone with a disability, and now they're talking about universal access. And I believe universal design and universal design for access to voting system is a way to go. So you don't have a separate and special location for voting, but everything about voting is accessible for all.
I think that's an excellent point for two reasons. One, if you have one machine over in the corner, then it's looked at as if only one or two people use that machine throughout the entire day, then you can possibly determine whose votes were actually determined from those machines, which is not what the intent of voting is. The other aspect of that is it's not a separate but equal mentality. And so that if you have all the voting machines working together or working the same, or not having one in the corner there, then it's looked at as everything is equal. And I think that as we move forward with the new voluntary voting system guidelines that were passed by the EAC in February, that we should be able to start having standards put in place, and hopefully the companies can build towards that, that we are having one system in a polling place that can function in that sort of realm. When HAVA was passed, we didn't have these wonderful computers in our pockets known as smartphones that have done a wonder to advance communications and accessibility. And I think that as we move forward throughout the 21st century, we should be able to advance that even more.
That's a great point. All right, so right now we're going to launch into just some conversational question and answers for the panelists that I will host. I encourage everybody in the audience, all attendees today, to submit any questions that you have for our panelists for us to discuss in the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So one of the things we talked about is there's been many recommendations, voluntary and required by law, right, made to ensure that voting process is more accessible. So we have poll worker training, we have placing accessible voting machines in accessible locations. These are some simple and inexpensive improvements that can be made quickly to improve access for all. Can the panelists talk a little bit today about what's preventing those things from happening and what can be done to fix that? Kind of the simple solutions that still aren't taking hold.
I can jump in, Valerie. One of the things we're seeing around the world it's really a consistent trend is a lack of understanding of what accessibility means. And similarly, not involving enough people with disabilities themselves in political leadership positions, both as elected officials, but also as poll workers and election observers, and sort of the whole gambit of political participation. In terms of what can be done to fix it, we can refer back perhaps also to election observation, because that's one way to ensure accountability with those laws and policies that are in place. However, many election observation missions don't include people with disabilities as observers, and election observation organizations are also still sort of learning what accessibility means as well. For example, a few years ago, I was in, I won't name it, in an Eastern European country doing an election observation and working with some disabled persons organizations. And a big international observer group published their preliminary findings after the election, just a couple days after the election, saying that about 60% of the polling stations around the country were accessible. I had been there, I had gone around with our DPO partners, had not seen any polling stations that were accessible, not a one. So I went to the head of the International Observer Group and asked, where are these polling stations that you found that, that you're documenting over half of them in the country are accessible. Even in the US, we don't have over half of our polling stations accessible, according to the Government Accountability Office report. So, where are these stations? And the head of the International Observer Mission said that the training they had given their election observers was that if there were 3 steps or fewer, that counted as accessible. And I think we all will agree that does not count as accessible. And so imagine how much that undermined the local disability community's advocacy with government there. If you're hearing from people with disabilities domestically, polling stations are not accessible, polling stations are not accessible. But then this big international, very well-known observer group comes in and says, good job, over half your polling stations are accessible. It really undercut their advocacy. So there's, I think, a need to understand what accessibility means. And part of the way that we can do that is by including more people with disabilities in political leadership positions.
Thank you.
I think one of the biggest things that needs to be thought of is that people feel that they don't have a disability. And I would say that, and when I say that, I mean to say that if you live long enough, you will have some form of a disability that will require some sort of need moving forward. Right now, I wear contact lenses. If I go into a polling place without my glasses or contact lenses, I won't be able to read the screens, and so I would need help. As my friends and family get older, they need more help with mobility issues. And I think that those are other things that people in a certain age group don't feel that they will have those issues. And like Virginia said, 3 steps means a lot if you can't get up those 3 steps. And so I think that's one of the biggest hurdles that we have, is that people don't feel that they have a disability or will have a disability, and therefore there's no need to change the way the system is now.
That's a great point. We're talking about knowledge, and then we're also talking about awareness, right? So it's not us, it's them, the separation between different types of communities and firsthand experience. Thank you. Let's shift a little bit to technology. Ed, I wanted to ask you a little bit about some gaps in today's technology. So what do you see as 1 or 2 of the most significant gaps in today's technology for assisting voters with disabilities?
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Karr. There are certainly a few. We have, as pointed out earlier, the 1 unit deployed in the polling place, 1 accessible unit. That's just not a good model for so many reasons. You have then poll worker training issues, off times. Certainly when a system is first rolled out to a jurisdiction, you don't even see those units powered up. And that's because the poll workers deal with usually a precinct optical scanner where people are filling out a paper ballot, marking the ovals or squares and putting them in the machine and casting their ballot in that manner. They focus on getting that machine up and going, and the machine that may not even be used if no one needs it or seeks it that day doesn't even get powered on or set up. that part of the poll worker training. They just didn't pay quite the same attention to it. So that's another reason why the universal machines, like you see in Los Angeles and some other parts of the country, are just a better paradigm in general. Commissioner Hicks pointed out that if you only have one person vote on that machine, then their ballot is subject to losing its secrecy, meaning after the voter has left and at the end of the day through the normal poll worker processes, they can, if they look at it, they can tell how that person voted, which of course is not in keeping with federal law and well, state laws too, for that matter. Gaps also involve technology evolution. The deployment of voting machines and the age of voting machines around the country has quite a lot of diversity. There are many jurisdictions that have purchased new systems after the 2016 cycle and were used in the 2020 cycle. Those machines have up-to-date motherboards with good quality audio, good graphics, a nice presentation to the voter, and one in keeping with the aforementioned smartphones that we all use and have smooth graphics and smooth capabilities for those with accessible needs. On the other hand, there are jurisdictions using voting machines that were first deployed as early as 1987. And of course, the graphics and the audio on those machines is not up to par relative to a machine that was manufactured or is manufactured currently. So there are some gaps, both temporal, there's some gaps in deployment, as I pointed out. Those are the two main ones that come to mind.
Thank you, Ed. You alluded to them, but what about components off the shelf? So how have they affected positively or negatively innovation that could help voters with disabilities access?
Sure, off the shelf has been a help to the voting system manufacturers. I mentioned motherboards earlier, I'll just start there, but motherboards, the audio capabilities, the audio processing and speed capabilities, graphics capabilities of today's computers are just quantum leaps ahead of what they were when the Help America Vote Act was passed in October of 2002. We've all experienced that, whether it's through our smartphones, laptops, desktops, computers. They all have benefited, and the voting systems have benefited from that as well. Memory, storage, processing power, the oft better, faster, cheaper, lighter, stronger, all of those adjectives that people use to describe electronics come into play here. Lighter is good for election workers. Many election workers are elderly, and when the equipment is lighter and easier to deal with for them, then that's a plus for the usability of the system relative to the election workers. When the graphics and the audio are good, the blind voter benefits from that. When the processing power of the computers inside those voting machines is faster, everybody benefits because the response times are more what you're used to. When a voter of any stripe touches a button and there's some lag, some noticeable lag before the equipment responds, as you see in some of the older and retired machines, that creates a problem, and people will end up hitting that button multiple times, which could take them to a place in the process they didn't intend to be, and create confusion. All of those things lend to a poor voter experience, not a good voter experience, and thus represent a place where technology, off-the-shelf technology, has helped the machines to move forward and avoid those sorts of situations.
Thank you, Ed. I'd like to open this question around technology and voting access up to our other panelists. Have you had any commentary on off-the-shelf technology or technological assistance for voters with disabilities recently? Tom?
Yes, one of the things that I would hope to see moving forward is some sort of use your own device sort of thing, in terms of if I am used to using my own smartphone, that I could use some sort of, and I know this gets to be a little bit of a hot topic, but that I could vote on my phone, but scan that in and have that printed out at the polling place, so that I'm used to my own technology, and some sort of barcode or QR code is scanned and therefore printed out after the fact and put into the polling and put into a receiving ballot for the tally of the votes. So you still have that tangible paper trail down the line. That could be a really great use of technology and would help with a number of issues that people may have in terms of not being familiar with the technology, cognitive issues because they are able to use what they are already used to, and speed factors. One of the biggest issues that we saw in 2012 for all elections, or for the general election, was long lines. And so the longer someone stands in line, the easier it is for them to walk away and not cast their vote. And I think that could be a huge issue as well.
Indeed. Let me build on Commissioner Hicks' comments. We see products such as one that Los Angeles County gives to its citizens that they termed interactive sample ballot. And it is this sort of online ballot delivery where you receive your ballot electronically. You prepare either a paper copy or a copy that you leave on your mobile phone that has a QR code. You still have to go to the polling place and be credentialed and show that QR code to a voting machine in the vote center or a polling place. And then your selections are essentially pre-made. If you don't feel the need to change your selections from what you made them at home, then your process is quite quick. And as Commissioner Hicks mentioned, there's huge benefits. So for the person with perhaps mobility issues or who cannot stand for long periods of time, you avoid the lines. You can go to a line kind of like at Disney with Fast Pass or whatever they call it. You move there and go to the credentialing station and ultimately to the voting machine quickly. Once you're there, instead of scrolling through what can be many, many pages of ballots, ballots in the United States are quite a lot longer. I know Virginia can tell you that internationally ballots are generally only a few contests. Here, it's not uncommon, especially if you have retention of judges, courtroom judges. You can have 90, 100 contests on a ballot, which is generally not heard of outside the United States. Nonetheless, with interactive sample ballot and similar products out there on the market, you can vote at home. You go to the polling place to actually mark and cast your ballot. And so now you've avoided just a plethora of issues that accessible needs voters can have, whether it's mobility, dexterity, ability to stand for long periods of time, cognitive issues, as Commissioner Hicks pointed out. It really is a very, very nice technology for the disabled.
Thank you, Ed. Virginia, I want to open it up to you. Any concerns about the use of these types of technologies?
I mean, I think there's differences between every country, and the first issue is trust. You know, is there trust in the process in general to be able to introduce new forms of technology or other types of assistive devices, whether they're related to technology or not? And that's something that's going to be very different in every country. For example, in Estonia, there's internet voting across the whole country. But Estonia, number one, the government provides internet access for free across the whole country. So you don't have these issues with lack of access to internet in rural communities or a digital divide because of that. But also in Estonia, there's a lot of trust in the Election Commission and in the process. So it is possible to do that. But that is not the case in most countries around the world. Also in many of the places where IFIS works, not just internet voting, but technological solutions are sometimes problematic because of power outages, for example, or because maybe we've seen this happen. I've gone to a warehouse at one election commission where they had all of these wonderful machines, touch screen machines that had all of these different accessibility features. They were used for one election and then put in this shed basically to get rained on and dust flying in and everything, and they weren't usable again. So the contexts are different in every country, but I would say that voters with disabilities have the same concerns as all other voters in wanting to make sure that their vote is safe, secret, and secure. And so that isn't different for voters with disabilities compared to voters without disabilities.
Thank you, Virginia. I was thinking that to recap, you had said there needs to be trust in the system, but we have to have fair and equitable services. And certain services need to be free to ensure equity, right, for voting with technology and the use of technology. You mentioned Estonia, and I was wondering if the panelists could talk, are we seeing any other practices from outside North America with regard to accessibility that we should be emulating here in the US?
I can, oh, Tom, please.
No, go ahead. No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was going to say the thing that we need is creative solutions that are locally driven. So for example, Tom has also heard me say this before, but I think one of the best examples is from the Philippines, where there are these huge mega shopping centers everywhere across the country, and they are all accessible because of course businesses want money. So they've built these massive shopping centers in very accessible ways. Whereas schools, where most of the polling stations are in the Philippines, as well as most countries around the world, are not accessible. So the Election Commission actually signed a partnership there with the biggest chain of shopping malls so that people with disabilities could register to vote in the mall. And then that was expanded to also allow people with disabilities to vote in the shopping mall. So imagine how convenient that is if it's already somewhere that you're maybe already going, you can run an errand, it's not out of the way in some random government building that you're never going to go to again or have any other reason to be there. So that's one really good example. Something else that happens in Kosovo, in Canada, quite a few countries around the world is the election commissions post the accessibility features of each polling station on their website. And you can go online and you can see, yes, my polling station is fully accessible, or you can see, well, the polling station itself is accessible, but maybe the restroom is not. Or you can tell exactly what the issue is and determine if you want to go to vote there, or some countries will then let you change your polling station to a different one that meets the accessibility requirements that you're most comfortable with. Another example that I think most countries need to do a better job about is around intellectual and psychosocial disability. Sri Lanka, for their elections last year, had an excellent example with this, where the Election Commission partnered with a mental health organization and actually got the election commissioner to issue a statement saying that political parties should refrain from using derogatory language that sort of further stigmatizes people with psychosocial disabilities. And that statement from the chairman of the Election Commission was really quite impactful, issued to all the political party leaders and the media. And it reaffirmed the rights of people with psychosocial disabilities to vote, and also sort of tampered down on this ableist hate speech language that often flares up around elections. And that's something that in the US and most countries around the world, there's not enough being done. Similarly, putting information in easy to read formats for people with intellectual disabilities is something the UK Election Commission and British civil society are really excellent at. And other countries have been doing this more recently as well, including Moldova and Uganda. So we really need to look at people with all different types of disabilities and not just think of voting access for people with physical disabilities or visual disabilities, which is often where the discussion usually leads.
Thank you, Virginia. Tom?
Well, I think back to South Africa's first election after apartheid, where they put several things up on their ballot to ensure that everyone could basically vote in a way that, because I think that one of the biggest issues that we still have is illiteracy. That I know that the country itself overall, there's a low literacy rate, but I think that there's still a number of people who simply can't read. And so I think that even having simple pictures of the candidates might be helpful moving forward. You run into a few other issues with that, but I think that could be one way to help with that. But I think that in terms of other technologies, I think that there should be other things that can be done. And I'm happy that we were able to pass the voluntary voting system guidelines this past winter to move the ball forward with that. One of the best parts of my job is being able to travel to different jurisdictions to see some of the things that they work on. But with 2020, that was impossible to do. But I'm hoping that as we move forward with 21, 22, that I can get back out there and see what jurisdictions are doing, and seeing how we can incorporate that other jurisdictions may be able to see those sorts of things, because the EAC, as it serves as a clearinghouse for jurisdictions that might not be able to see what other innovative ideas are being done around the country. I think that could be really useful for moving forward with getting rid of some of the aspects of people not being able to cast their ballots.
These are all great points. I think you've touched on information and communication really clearly, right? So having clear understanding of the processes, but also the information you need to make an informed vote in a clear and understandable manner. I particularly like the ease of access in the Philippines and kind of being able to understand and vote easily, right? That this is a process that we have the right to do, but also it's something that is sometimes heavily onerous on certain populations. And we need to make sure that we're allowing that access to really be fulfilled. I have another question, and this is about internet voting, which we haven't talked about. This is, is internet voting a good thing for people with disabilities?
Well, it's the third rail that that we still hear about. 20 years later, when the Department of Defense had the SERV project, I think that still is a hot topic for people to consider. But I think that there are ways to ensure that people's votes remain private and secure, but also remain to have access for those folks who don't have the ability to come into a polling place. On demand balloting, one of the things that we saw with the pandemic was that electronic ballot delivery was done for a number of jurisdictions. And I believe that 3 jurisdictions actually allowed for the return of that electronic ballot. There are still a lot of security issues that are being debated about it, but I think in terms of an accessibility issue, that we should be able to look for grants to run pilots to see about moving this forward. And the reason I say that is because computer scientists and other advocacy groups have talked about security for over 20 years, but they've not really talked about how do we get past this sort of issue. They keep saying that we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this. But my question is, to this day, of how do we move past this? If someone's claiming to be a computer scientist, then they should be able to come up with a computer solution to some of these issues, and look towards grants to get that sort of things done. So.
I agree with Commissioner Hicks entirely. And rather than shutting off discussion, rather than shutting off debate, rather than moving the pendulum all the way over to the security side and taping it to the inside of the clock so that it can't move off that, having a reasoned debate and having pilots and dealing with these security issues in an iterative fashion and moving them forward is the answer. But there are groups who simply say no. They've not undertaken any sort of risk assessment or risk management approach to the situation. They simply just say no and do everything they can to shut off discussion. That is wrong, and it is a very ableist point of view.
I can just add, Valerie, I mean, disability advocates from around the world where IFIS is working have been asking for internet voting for years and advocating for that. It means they don't have to worry about an inaccessible public transportation or waiting in a queue, or worry about getting to the polling station and it's not accessible, or dealing with poll workers who might question their right to vote in the first place. And then there's also benefits around independence and privacy. So you can use your own assistive device when you're voting from home, like an adaptive keyboard or software like a screen reader, or maybe you have voice recognition software on your own device at home. And you could use all of that to mark the ballot. And all of those different features which you're familiar with might not be available if you're at the polling station. And then of course, as Tom mentioned, in the current context, internet voting provides a way that you can vote safely without risking exposure to the virus. One example is from Australia, where voting is compulsory. So everybody has to vote in Australia. So they really need to seek actively, solutions to accessibility. And in New South Wales, internet voting and telephone voting have been open to voters since 2011. And after those initial, originally it was just voters with disabilities and rural residents. And it's now been expanded to all voters in New South Wales, these internet voting and telephone voting systems. But that said, there have also been in these cases security concerns, and it hasn't been rolled out across all of Australia so far. So I guess broadly speaking, to answer your question, internet voting is a good thing for people with disabilities, as long as we can figure out these security concerns and make sure those are addressed.
Thank you, all three of you. That was very informative. I have the converse of this question, right? So how do we reconcile the need for paper ballot records for security with limitations of those who can't or may not be able to handle paper ballots?
Well, I'll speak outside of internet voting for a moment and go to in-person voting and use of things like interactive sample ballot. In Los Angeles, the paper ballot that the voter receives once they're credentialed, the blank paper ballot, is put into the machine. And you may have seen in the video, it probably slipped by pretty quickly, that once the voter has made his or her selections, the ballot prints out and comes back out of the machine. It's still under control of the rubber rollers in the ballot printing portion of the machine, but it sits on a work surface to the voter's right within the booth. And if they have dexterity or other issues to where they cannot take the paper off of the surface of the machine, they don't have to. They can simply leave it there. If they're sighted, view the ballot. If they're not, they use the audio to have it read back to them, and then either touch on a screen button or a keypad button, a button that allows them to cast their ballot, and the machine will take the ballot back into itself and deposit into the attached ballot box. So essentially the workflow is such that you get all of the features, all of the abilities to mark and to verify the marked ballot, which is a very important part of the process that sometimes gets overlooked, and then cast that ballot, just the same workflow as a voter who is not using any of the accessible features of the device. So that is one way to address that problem, setting up the voter workflow to where they do not have to touch the ballot. They can, a voter can remove it from the surface of the machine, look at it to suit themselves and put it back in the machine, but they don't have to. So that's one way at least to address that issue on an in-person voting situation.
Virginia, you can go first.
The one thing that we're seeing used quite frequently in many countries around the world are tactile ballot guides. And this is where you take the ballot, the same ballot that everyone else would be using, and you put it inside a folder that has either raised dots that are tactile if people in the country are not fluent in Braille, or has Braille. Or in the case, for example, of Armenia, it has both tactile and Braille. And there's little holes in the folder that align with the same marks where you would put on the ballot, your check marks on the ballot. And so you can use Braille or the tactile to just determine where you'd like to make your mark. And then when you take your ballot out, it looks the same as everybody else's ballot. Because beforehand, quite a few years ago, we were seeing some countries put Braille on the actual ballots, but only on a handful of them. And that meant the same issue that Tom brought up before with the separate electronic voting machine, that at the end of the day, when poll workers were counting, you could see 2 or 3 ballots that had Braille on them, and because they looked different, and then know how those people voted. So these tactile ballot guides, these folders, are a much better solution. And those can be used both for voting in person, as well as in some countries, there are mobile ballot boxes that can go to your home and bring the ballot, or to hospital if you can't leave to go to the polling station. And these assistive devices don't always come with those mobile ballot boxes, but ideally they should.
One of the things I look back on is Florida 2000, which was all about paper. And I believe that one of the things that we should be moving away from is the use of people actually handling paper. And so to have it so that as we move towards more of the, we're almost at a third of the century. I guess we're 1/5 at 2020. So 1/5 of the century is already passed. Why are we still looking at paper as the only way to tangibly count ballots? And so I still say that we need to advance technology. When I was talking about literacy before, I was thinking about my own children in terms of if I want to do something that they can't read, I'll write it in cursive, because cursive is not taught in school anymore. So it's like a new language that they can't really interpret. So that's what I mean by they see things, they're fine, but if you do things that just the slightest thing, then they become unable to function. And so they can't read cursive, so they wouldn't be able to function that way. And so I was thinking of sending them postcards and so forth, and thinking about paper, and that's where I got off on that tangent. So that's a long way of saying that I think we should move away from paper some way, somehow, but some sort of tangible way to make sure that the ballots are still accurate. And I don't have the answer to it, but I think that's why you do pilots and you move the ball forward with it.
And the new VVSG does have end-to-end cryptographic system requirements built into it. So there is an opportunity for voting system providers to build a system that conforms to those requirements. And one of those requirements is, in fact, that you provide the voter some thing when they've completed their voting session that they can't use to prove to someone else how they voted. So they can't use it to sell their vote, essentially, but that they can use to verify that their vote as intended and is cast is in the system and is part of the eventual tallies. So there is, for the first time, agree to your comment earlier, that's internet voting is the third rail in American election integrity politics, but there is now in VVSG some requirements around what a system like that would look like.
Let's shift into audience Q&A. Over this discussion, we've had some fascinating questions come in. If you're in the audience as an attendee, please submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There's a few policy questions and a few kind of current day politics questions. One is, will the S1 bill currently in Senate be good or bad for the disabled community?
I would say that as a staffer who worked in the U.S. Congress for over a decade, what you see as the initial introduced legislation is rarely the piece of legislation that comes to the president's desk for signature. And if this piece of legislation gets to the president, I would think that there would be a number of amendments to be done for it. But the ultimate goal with any legislation is to improve the process and not, when I was on the Hill, I would say that one of the things that we would want to do is for the one piece of legislation that we write, we don't want three to fix the problems from that one. And so I'm hoping that as they move forward with this to eliminate some of the issues that they may have not foreseen at that time, so that it would be an improvement upon anything that's out there today.
Some drafts I've seen enshrine, unfortunately, the one accessible device per polling location, which is, I think, a step backwards. It also prohibits internet voting full stop in federal elections, which is going to have a chilling effect on the development of that technology. So there are some elements that are not good there. On the other hand, requiring early voting, which I know a number of accessible voters who take advantage of because the lines oftentimes are a little shorter and they have more hours from which to choose to go and cast their ballot in person. Those things are a net positive. So like many pieces of legislation, there's some good, there's some bad.
And then at the state level, how do restrictive voting laws emerging in many states impact the accessibility of voting for persons with disabilities?
Well, I'll go ahead again because the theme is essentially the same. When you restrict voting hours and voting channels, such as ballot drop boxes, that's not good for voters in general. It hurts both the accessibility and the usability of the electoral infrastructure. Having more and different ways to cast your ballot is always best, and having more time opportunities to cast your ballot is better too.
I agree with that. So I don't think they have anything else to add to that.
I'm seeing a common theme in the questions is expanding early voting, mail-in voting, increased drop boxes, internet voting. We have a question related to Braille and accuracy issues. Have there ever been any concerns with ballots to have known accuracy issues with Braille ballots?
Yeah, that's a good question and something to be aware of. What IFAS recommends and what we encourage and facilitate in countries where we're working is making sure that you're involving people who are fluent in Braille in the design of the tactile ballot guide, which seems very obvious, but unfortunately definitely doesn't always happen. Very often, similarly with sign language, election commissions will think they're doing a good job and get sign language interpreters in their voter education videos that they're airing on national TV stations, but they, in some cases, are employing sign language interpreters who are not accredited. So for example, one country last year in Africa, one of the election commissions did this really big campaign and for the first time ever included sign language in all their videos. But in all of the videos, the sign language interpreter was using the sign for jogging rather than the sign for run for election. So the whole message was incorrect, all because they didn't consult with the deaf community and didn't hire an interpreter that was accredited, and just went on their own and tried to find someone. So the big lesson here, both in terms of making sure that your tactile ballot guides have accurate information in Braille, but also that any of your accessible information is actually accurate, is working with people with disabilities in the countries where you're working and making sure that they're involved in the design, development, and implementation of any voter education materials you're developing or assistive devices.
I agree. You have to have people who are able to understand the issues as part of the solution, and not coming in at the back end where it becomes a problem.
I've also seen that in my research. Any mistranslation of any type of language can lead to major conflicts down the road. We have a couple questions related to particular types of disabilities. So how do we use technology and accessibility features to ensure that individuals who have cognitive disabilities versus physical disabilities can vote?
So there are technologies, and cognitive has been a part of VVSG for many years, addressing cognitive disabilities. Ballot design is a big piece of that. It's a back office function, so it doesn't get as much glitz and glamour, but ballot design is huge. I mean, just the worst thing you can do for someone with, say, mild traumatic brain injury is to have a contest that you have the question and or the office title, and say there are 4 candidates, and 2 candidates appear on one side of a paper ballot card and the other 2 candidates appear on the back side of the paper ballot card, or even worse, you have a 2-card ballot and part of the contest is on one card and part of the contest runs off into a second card. That is just a horrible, horrible ballot design, and today's election management software, ballot layout software, does not allow that sort of thing. But that would be an example of what would really create just an incredible amount of confusion to someone who has cognitive disabilities. And I'm speaking somewhat in general, but I think that the general is a good case here. You know, one thing about politics in the United States, and I mentioned it earlier, we tend to have a lot of contests on the ballot, and that creates a mental fatigue situation for people with some cognitive impairments as well. And then looking at the voting machine design, as I mentioned, cognitive impairment has been part of the VVSG for many, many years. And so you see some things around use of colors. You see use of plain language in VVSG 2.0, although that's been somewhat of a de facto standard for years. There's probably others that I just can't think of offhand, where designing for the usability of voters with cognitive issues is existent in the voting machines.
I think that those are great. One of the things that I constantly think about is for allowing for early voting, 1, and then 2, the electronic ballot delivery. So that if I have a cognitive disability, then I can be at home with my electronic ballot to look at that with my own device or at my own pace, without being in a polling place, being forced to vote within 5 minutes or however the time frame that people are in line for. That gives me an opportunity to make an informed decision on the choices that I want to make. And I hope that as we move forward, that those things are not taken away from voters.
Yeah, I would agree with both of those things that Ed mentioned and that Tom mentioned. And something else we've seen that's been quite effective is simulations, where you can go experience sort of the voting process in advance in practice. And that's something that we've seen many countries do, targeting voters with intellectual disabilities, and also targeting first-time voters, so that you can go to an actual polling station, set up the way that it would be on election day, and practice looking at the ballot, seeing what that means. They've done fake ballots, vote for apples and oranges and bananas and things instead, but just so you can get used to the process. And that's also been quite effective.
I really like these recommendations. You have some high tech and some very low tech. Just this is what accommodation looks like. Allowing for more time, right, is something that allowing people to think through the process and make that informed choice is helpful. I'm going to move to a funding question because this one interested me, but what tips can the panelists offer for local officials to get better funding or secure grants to cover ADA related expenses? So universally designed voting booths, privacy solutions, infrastructure at the polling place, such as ramps, doorknobs, and facilities. We talked a little bit about that in the international arena and countries overseas, but what about here in the US?
So over the last 3 years, the EAC has given out close to $1 billion in terms of funding to the states to improve the process. That's nowhere near what is actually needed to improve the elections in the U.S. I would say talk to your local election officials in terms of elected officials, but also talk to the U.S. Congress folks. If they hear from you that your roads need to be fixed, they will put more money into the transportation bill. If they hear that elections need to be done, they will put more money into that. We received $400 million last year to get out to the states, but we received zero this time around to give to the states because elections were seen as this was 8 months ago. And so unless there is a push to elected officials that this is something that needs to be funded on a dedicated funding stream, because federal elections occur every 2 years, then these things won't be funded at a rate that's needed to move the ball forward. I will say that before 2002, with the Help America Vote Act being passed, the federal government put in absolutely $0 towards federal elections. And it was entirely the burden upon the states to fund those elections. So we've moved away from that, but we still need to make sure that funding is adequate and that states have some sort of skin in the game by having some sort of, buy-in of whether or not that's 5, 15, or 20% of matching funds to that. But I would still say to talk to your elected officials about ensuring that funding is adequately done for technology and moving the process forward.
I think that's a great response. And you remind me that access to voting is not just about access to voting, it's about community access. So when you talked about transportation and the roads, right? If we don't have accessible transportation, accessible subways, rail trains, public transportation, even roads to ride down, we're creating an inaccessible environment. And Virginia and I were talking a few weeks ago about this, about how polling places often are in schools, and in development contexts, schools are not accessible in all places. And they said, well, we have no children with disabilities here, so we're not going to make voting accessible just for the voting process. And I think, Virginia, you were the one who chimed in and said, well, if you make the school accessible, then children with disabilities will be able to attend school as well. And, we often get siloed, I think, in terms of our perspective on topics related to disability. Like, we're only handling voting, but what about community access? What about access to the education system in that context?
I think that's a great point. I guess it's a little bit closer to a year ago now, where I live, my polling place, what the early voting site was actually the government center, which also had the police station. And so the question becomes, I have to go to the police station to cast my vote. And so people were thinking back to the 50s and 60s when police dogs were being used and so forth, and the Black Lives Matter issues and things like that now. And so it was, why is the early voting site the police station? And so it's things like that that need to be talked about and move forward. So, and it's not everywhere, but it's just things that people should talk about.
And a general awareness. And then I'll take one more question. We have listeners from overseas, so we don't have just a US audience today. We have a listener here in Mozambique, and she's asking from a disability community, if we're at a very different stage, how can we ensure that universal design is taken into consideration from the outset? So I don't know if you've had any tips or practices. How do we start this conversation in countries overseas that may not be including the disability community in their voting and election process?
Well, I think, personally, I think that some of the overseas countries have a leg up than the United States, because here in the U.S., I work for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission, but we don't run the elections for any of the states or any jurisdiction. But in overseas countries, their election management bodies run the election. And so you have a central location to actually talk to folks to ensure that the issues that you see arising now are taken care of from the onset. In the U.S., there's between 8,000 and 10,000 jurisdictions, and so voting jurisdictions, and it's impossible to have one uniform method of voting or talk to all these folks about ways to improve the process. We do the best we can, but I think that other countries have a leg up on that by having one body talking to the entire country and having one implemented system of ensuring that things are done uniformly.
Yeah, the other thing I'd add, I agree with Tom, it is much different here when we have basically 50 different processes and 50 different ballots and laws, and everything is all different. And in most countries around the world, that's not the case. But also in most countries around the world, the governments have ratified the UN Disability Treaty that I mentioned earlier. And often, though, it's because it's a disability rights treaty, it's ratified, and then implementation enforcement is sort of considered the purview of the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Social Welfare. And so the Election Commission often doesn't even know that there's this whole article, Article 29, focused very explicitly on participation in political and public life. So one thing that you could do is make sure that your government knows that most likely your country has ratified this international standard, and you can help them look good because they have to report back to the UN on their biannual basis. So you can help them look good in their reporting by implementing this Article 29. Similarly with the Sustainable Development Goals. Sustainable Development Goal 16 is related to political participation broadly, and there's also a voluntary national review process that happens at the UN. So again, you can help them look good at these big international forums if they're doing a good job on implementation and enforcement of those two. And then the last thing I would suggest is, in some countries around the world, the US government or the British government or the Canadians are helping to fund the elections, and they're helping to fund the Election Commission and some of their policies and procedures. So you can go to the US Embassy or the UK Embassy or whatever is relevant and say to them, hey, we need your help to make sure that our Election Commission is, developing tactile ballot guides or training poll workers on accessibility features or whatever it is that you would like. And I would definitely think that would hopefully be a helpful pressure point for you to use if those different embassies are funding your elections.
Thank you, Virginia. Thank you, Commissioner. Edwin, do you have any concluding remarks? So I think we're 3 o'clock, so we're going to wrap up.
Thank you to all the participants. Much appreciated. There are certainly gaps with usability and accessibility. The technology can fill and is filling, and the technology is improving. Where it was when I entered this industry in 2001 to where it is today is really just amazing. And I look forward to seeing where the technology takes us with accessibility and usability in the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, thank you to all the panelists. This has been a wonderful discussion. It's really highlighted how access is about not only awareness, infrastructure, policy, law, funding. It's a very intersectional issue and one that I'm glad that people are paying attention to. So thank you for joining me today, and I look forward to continuing the dialogue.
Thank you for having me and having us.
Yes, thank you.
Bye now.
Thank you.